this is where, when you start thinking about microbiomes and the relationship between the microbiome and its host, so that's the plant, the person, the cow, the dog, whatever, and you realize, oh, this whole notion about evolution being about, there's this phrase, nature red in tooth and claw. And that is about the side of, let's say, it's a typical predator-prey relationship. That's the cheetah chasing the gazelle and getting it, and that's how evolution works. And the faster cheetah will always be the one, that will survive and have offspring and so on. But what the microbiome is teaching us is that your little tiny bacterium, you're not going to do anything on your own. You yourself are not going to get anything done. You are in relationship with at least two other main things: your host and everybody else in your microbial community.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project, a grassroots farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label that distinguishes soil-grown crops and pasture-raised livestock. You just heard from author and biologist Anne Biklé speaking about how we're not just what we eat, but what our food and our microbiomes eat. This is the first part of a two-part episode with Anne, and today you'll hear her speak about soil biology, the soil microbiome, and plant exudates. Before we dive in with Anne, we'd like to mention that all of our podcast episodes are also filmed. If you'd like to watch our guests in person, please head on over to our website, realorganicproject.org, or find us on YouTube. Now let's get back to the conversation between my co-director Dave Chapman and author Anne Biklé.
And my guest today is Anne Biklé, an old friend who is the co-author of The Hidden Half of Nature and spoke at our first symposium at Dartmouth College 2 years ago. Welcome, Anne.
Yeah, hi, Dave. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. So, we're going to go through a little journey. I want to get into your new book, but I'd like to start with just a little bit of history. You have become somebody who really cares a lot about food. Were you always that way? What was your story? How did you come to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to a certain extent, I'm like any human being, and the delight, of a good meal and flavor and all of those things that you associate with food, that was just sort of, my normal part of being a human being. And it wasn't until, I'd say much later in my life, that I became way more interested in this, this whole thing that took on the name of the food system. And although I do have to say, I'd always been very interested in plants. I've got a bad, you may have heard me say this before, but it is true. It hasn't changed. I do have a bad case of plant lust. And whenever you're growing a plant, sooner or later you find yourself in a garden, or you find yourself thinking about farms and soil and all of the plants that become our food. And it was probably almost, when would that have been? Probably almost a decade or so ago, maybe longer actually. I made a career switch. My background is in biology, and I had been working on river restoration and salmon issues out here in the Seattle area. And there was a position that came open in our local public health department. And I did not have a public health background. By background, I'm, like I said, biology, but also environmental planning. And at that time, the local health department was interested in hiring a planner to help them with a new program that was looking at connections between, it's kind of bad lingo, but connections between the built environment and our health. And the built environment, all that is that's the habitat in which people live, right? So that was a very easy leap for me to make, because my entire sort of professional career and education up to that point had been thinking about the habitat of other things, of non-human things, of the plants and the fish and lizards and tortoises and, all of these other things I had done. So it put habitat in a new frame for me. And one of the things that I did when I was working at the health department was to try to influence policy so that we could somehow get the public health workforce could sort of get their arms around this whole problem of what is called chronic diseases. So these are non-infectious diseases. So, unlike COVID, type 2 diabetes, for example, or hypertension, or any of those autoimmune conditions, they don't per se come from an infectious agent. They're basically metabolic disorders or disorders of the immune system. And so I thought that was really interesting. And that's when I became aware, way more aware of links between diet and health. And then I became very interested in, plants are growing in the soil, and what are these feedbacks and relationships that are going on between plants, which have a good number of nutrients that we need, and how is this affecting people's health? So that in a way was sort of my way into food through the public health frame. But I always had this biology baggage with me, always ever wondering, why are things this way and how are things this way and what are the mechanisms behind that? And what does knowing about the way that nature and natural systems work, what can that tell us about how we might change the way we grow our food? What could it tell us about how we might go about preventing chronic diseases, all those sorts of things. So that was sort of, that was a big entry point for me with food. And then, of course, anybody who's ever tried to grow any food, how difficult, it's not easy, and you gain a new appreciation for farmers and what they do and for your soil and for where this dang seed came from and all of the odd things that happen when you do grow food, which is, why is that thing flourishing? And it seems to me I did nothing different, and that the other plant right next to it isn't flourishing. So it was a good place for me to just learn about things and think about things. And I would hasten to say that I will never, ever, once you have your hands in the dirt growing plants, you're never going to turn, me anyway, there's no going back. I'm there.
Going back.
No going back.
All right. Well, so there's a couple things I want to unpack a little bit. First of all, that's interesting about investigating built spaces and how they affect our health. And I saw some really interesting stuff about the microbiome and engineering built spaces to enhance the microbiome. So as opposed to thinking about the most sterile environment that you could get, which I think was 50 years ago, maybe, the idea of a healthy space. They were talking about creating spaces that purposefully brought a more diverse microbiome into the human by what you're being exposed to. Is that anything that you encountered in your work?
Well, I think for sure what we do know about the human microbiome is that we got our microbiome in the first place from the environment outside of us. So that is to say, the air, the water, the food, and so on. And when I say that, I mean, I'm talking, way back early in human evolution when we were still, tromping around on the landscape, looking for things to eat, avoiding being eaten ourselves. Every surface that we came in contact with, every environment that we moved through was a source for, pulling another member into the human microbiome. And the same sort of thing, I mean, you just look at a baby crawling around on the floor, like we're, fast forward to modern life, and it's like that baby is gaining its microbiome, on the floor there. And what we know about the human microbiome is that you're gathering it. You're sort of harvesting your microbiome from the moment, well, some say even in the womb, up to about 5 years of life. That's when you're building it. That's when you're building your microbiome, and then it goes through changes as you yourself hit certain, life cycles, puberty, middle age, old age, and so on. But it is true that our outside environment and the places that we live are affecting our microbiome. And one of the big concerns with the human microbiome is how we may be losing some of it, because the biodiversity of this planet is the source for everything's microbiome. Ours, a bird, a whale, everything. And so as we begin to lose parts of the natural world, we're losing the biodiversity that is actually, important for us to be able to recruit members into the human microbiome. And the same goes for other animals, and no surprise here, plants have their own version of a microbiome. And where do they pick that up from? The soil. And that is why what is living in the soil is so important to a plant's health.
So, Anne, you're talking about the microbiome, which is a word that is used a lot these days, but I think a lot of people don't really understand what it means, and I think it's a relatively new part of at least popular understanding of science, and maybe for the pros too. So could you describe, when you're talking about human microbiome, let's start with the human microbiome, because I think that's most interesting to people. What do you mean?
Yeah, the human microbiome. So it's really interesting, Dave. We think of ourselves and our bodies as, contained within the little human figure with the arms and the legs and so forth. And it turns out that there's more to us than just our own human cells. What we have as a part of our body, what we now understand, is our microbiome. And the microbiome is simply communities of microorganisms, so bacteria, fungi, examples of microorganisms. And these communities are indigenous to our bodies. In other words, they are supposed to be there. And the lion's share of the human microbiome is where all the action is, where the food is, and that would be within our digestive tract. But we also have communities that are unique to our skin, say to the eye, to the nose, to the oral cavity, and so on. So really, in the simplest terms, the microbiome is a part of our bodies, and we have scientists who study the microbiome are super excited about this, because it's a new concept to people to think about. Oh, really? Communities of microorganisms in my body, like doing things? And, yes, it's true. Now, it's really interesting to juxtapose the human microbiome in these times with a pathogenic virus, like the virus that's causing COVID-19, because we think, oh, then maybe microbes are bad. Maybe we don't want them on our bodies. And this is where the microbial world throws us curveballs all the time. Every time you hear something about the microbiome or about a microorganism, beware when you hear a word like always or never or something like that, because as soon as that gets said, there's going to be some outlier. There's going to be some exception to that. And so what that means when we think about microbiomes in the context of health and disease is that it's a dynamic kind of a concept, and it has duality about it. That is, it can mean more than one thing. And so as with the other important thing to know about the human microbiome is all of these creatures are alive. I mean, with the exception of viruses, but they are alive, they live in us, and they pretty much eat what we eat. They eat the human diet. I mean, sometimes, if you get things out of whack, they're nibbling away maybe at some human things that you don't really want them nibbling away at. But for the most part, in a healthy person, a normally functioning microbiome, everything's, humming away just like it should.
And what happens if we lose those microbial populations that live in association with us? What happens to the human cells that are left?
Yeah, that's a big question, and that is a big subject of a lot of microbiome research is how has our microbiome changed over the course of human evolution, and how has the microbiome changed in particular with the sort of onset of industrialization and modernization and things like antibiotics and processed food and chlorinated drinking water and those sorts of things. You know, by and large, I don't think there's any one statement that you could say that says, oh, when we lose. Well, first of all, everyone's microbiome is unique. Just like our genome, just like our genes that we got from our mom and our dad, your microbiome is unique. So we wouldn't expect mine and yours to be the same, and we wouldn't expect that an absence of some particular member from my microbiome would mean that if it's also absent in you, that you're going to become sick or get some disease or something like that. But in general, our microbiome has sort of it functions in sort of there's these sort of foundational ways that we know that ecosystems and nature works. And one of those is that diversity is generally a good thing because all of your eggs are not in one basket. You've got multiple baskets, and if one basket goes, you've got 99 left. And when it comes to the microbial world, usually there's some other species of bacterium that can do the thing that maybe the one that you lost was doing. And so in other words, diversity means resilience. Diversity means, it's like a substitute teacher, except that substitute teacher might become your new, permanent teacher, so to speak. So that's a big area of research. And the way I think about it is I want my microbiome to be functioning. I want it to be diverse. I want it to be resilient. And so what are the things I'm going to do in my life that I at least have control over that best support my microbiome so that it sticks around, that it doesn't decide, oh man, this body's just not serving me. I'm, going to die off or leave or, something like that happening. So when it comes to microbiomes, we're also realizing how important they are to support because of all of the things they do. And just, anyone can easily find all this stuff out, but the human microbiome in particular is really important for modulating and educating our immune system. So, the simplest way to put that across is who's a friend, who's a foe, who can stay, and who has to go. And our microbiome also communicates with our nervous system. I mean, there's studies that show that cells in our gut that are really kind of like endocrine cells, they're picking up endocrine cells and nerve system cells. They're picking up communication from our microbiome that influences how we feel, whether we're happy, whether we're sad. And things like that. So it's turning out, that the microbiome, I mean, it goes beyond, that classic sort of hand in glove thing. I mean, our microbiome is so embedded and integrated with our biology that there's probably, little that is not affected by the human microbiome about the way that our bodies work and about how food and our diet, also affects our microbiome.
I heard, I think it was Zach Bush say that, when we're sitting together in a room, which we're not allowed to do anymore, that we actually share microbiomes, that I take in microbes from you and you take in microbes from me. And I thought that was actually a kind of a delightful idea or realization.
Yeah, it is. And we do know, for example, there's been studies that have been done if you have a cat or a dog or any kind of pet, or of course anyone who lives on a farm and is around, if they have animals, there's definitely exchanges that go on so that your microbiome will take on, you'll see some similarities between the dog microbiome and your microbiome. If, probably especially if the dog gets to sleep in the bed and eat at the dinner table and those kinds of things. And that's just sort of the way that I think nature works, right? We're all these organisms, and we're looking around for habitat, and we're looking around for places to be safe, rear our young, and eat good meals. I mean, that's kind of what all of this comes down to. And with these little tiny microorganisms, right, one little bacterium on its own can't do anything. But boy, you jump into a human body and you can go places. You can do things. You can see things. And that is, the microbial world has always been known for sort of turning on a dime when it comes to taking advantage, and I don't mean that in any judgmental way, but microbes are very good at seizing on new opportunities and going, oh, look, a new nutrient here, great, I think I'll have some of that. Or, oh, that's a bad habitat over there, I need to get away from this, like right away. So they're very adept in how they can move through environments, how they can do, and this is why antibiotic resistance exists and why certain species and types of microorganisms are so good at resisting the various sort of killing things that we throw at them. They're like, water off my back, I'm just going to go somewhere else. Or oh, I got a great gene from that bacterium so-and-so last week, and it just happens that I can use it to get this antibiotic out of my body and continue to survive. That's the other thing that the microbial world is really good at is, as we put it in the hidden half of nature, bacteria can exchange genes the way we once shook hands, I guess I should say it, in these times. But it's very casual. Sure. You can get what you need out there, in the environment if you're a bacterium.
Okay, so this is like Walt Whitman's phrase, I am a multitude. Yeah. And let's talk now about plant microbiome.
Yeah. Yeah, see, this is what's so interesting to me is that the plant scientists were on to the microbiome, although they didn't call it that. They were on to this fact that plants associate with microorganisms and always have. And that was partly because plant scientists were looking at soil. And when you look at soil, you will see that there are a great many things living in that soil. And then there is the plant body, the plant's green body. At least half, most of the times over half of its body is in contact with all of that life in the soil. And that would lead any thinking person, you don't even need to be a biologist or anything like that, to ask, wow, I wonder what are they talking about? What are they doing? What does this mean for the roots of the plant that it is, surrounded by, swathed with, coated in the life of the soil, a great deal of which is microorganisms. And there's one of the most replicated experiments in plant science, which is this. You take two of the same kind of plant, and you have one box of soil, and let's just say that's a native soil of some sort. It's got everything living in it that is supposed to be in that particular soil type. You then have another box where you took that soil and you sterilized it. So you killed off all of the life in the soil. Then you put your plants in there, and plants can grow because you're giving them water. There's, organic matter, even though there's not living things in the one soil. There's things in there that the plant can grow with. So they get going, and then you introduce a pathogen to these two boxes of soil with these two identical plants, and the plant that's living in the dead soil, it's taken out very, very quickly. The plant in the other soil, most of the time, it does okay. It might suffer a little bit, but it survives. And that led to a term, which I think is a pretty understandable term for a scientific term, that led to this whole notion of disease suppressive soils. So that's just what it sounds like. Oh, you mean soil can suppress diseases? Well, it can, depending on what you've got living in that soil. And so that's where the plant microbiome comes into the picture, because many people at the symposium and many farmers know this or are learning more about it, that plants are actively manufacturing a great number of compounds and chemicals in their green bodies. So they get all this energy from the sun, and they use that energy to build things. And one of the things they build are carbon compounds and proteins and fats, and they put these different combinations of those things together into something called an exudate. And so an exudate is really sort of a cocktail. It's a plant cocktail, but it's not for them. They're not drinking it. What they're doing is they're shunting those exudates down into their root system, and then they're pushing the exudates out into a very, very narrow zone right around their root. And that zone is called the rhizosphere. And this is thought to be one of the most life-dense, one of the most biodiverse places that we have on the planet. This little tiny nanozone around the roots of a plant that's filled with food. That's what all those exudates are, Dave. They're food. They're food for the soil microbiome. And this is where, when you start thinking about microbiomes and the relationship between the microbiome and its host, so that's the plant, the person, the cow, the dog, whatever, and you realize, oh, this whole notion about evolution being about, there's this phrase, nature red in tooth and claw. And that is about the side of, let's say, it's a typical predator-prey relationship. That's the cheetah chasing the gazelle and getting it, and that's how evolution works. And the faster cheetah will always be the one, that will survive and have offspring and so on. But what the microbiome is teaching us is that your little tiny bacterium, you're not going to do anything on your own. You yourself are not going to get anything done. You are in relationship with at least two other main things: your host and everybody else in your microbial community. And so this is where symbiosis comes into the picture. And we have something in the very front of the book of the hidden half that's called all for one and one for all. And what we mean by that is that when you think about evolution occurring in sort of a symbiotic lens, then it begins to make a lot more sense why a plant would be giving away this free food that it's worked hard to produce, and giving it away is not really what's happening down there in the root system. That plant is saying, hey, I've got these exudates, and I happen to need these nutrients that are sitting beyond my root system, like that phosphorus over there. And this is where what I call the fetching fungi come into play, because these fungi, and they're in particular mycorrhizal fungi, they have this ability to go way beyond the reach of a plant's root. And they're in the grocery store out there. They're getting things. They're getting things plants need. They're putting them in the grocery cart, and they're wheeling them back to the plant root and saying, great, I got a grocery cart of things for you, but in exchange, I would like those exudates. And so whenever you have sort of a very tightly coupled, and I do want to, I will say this is plain and simple and straight up a quid pro quo. You give me that, and I'll give you this. But that's how things work, and it is a productive relationship. It's a relationship that keeps things going. It's a relationship where the plant would be, up that proverbial creek without anything, and likewise the fungi would be left high and dry if it had no exudates. So this is where I think about life. Life binds itself to other forms of life. And when you do that, you can get a lot done. A lot done if you're a plant and a microbe. Now, a cheetah's got 4 legs and it's faster than heck, right? So it's going to have a different life strategy, and that's okay. And what we just, I think, need to realize is that there's more than one way to get a meal on this planet. Sometimes, you largely are doing it by yourself. Other times you're doing it in relationship to and in cooperation with other life forms. And that, I'd mentioned resiliency before. There's a lot of strength and resiliency behind that. Like the cheetah who breaks its leg is done for. You're done, right? The gazelle that's got the broken leg, you're done. You live in a community of microbes, or you live in a forest, or in let's say a farm setting where crops are growing in living, healthy soil. We know that plants share things between themselves. And we especially know that from forest ecosystems, because these are very long-lived, right? A tree is a long-lived thing, and it's got a lot of tricks up its sleeve for its long life. And one of those things is, wow, I used to be like, the tree next to me fell down and I had all of this sunlight, but the rest of my forest members, they don't. So I'm going to transfer, I'm going to photosynthesize like heck, and I'm going to share my carbon exudates with my fellow trees. And these fellow trees may, for example, have a rockin' relationship with some kind of, say, a fungi that's got its hyphae, cruising around in the grocery store out there. So that tree that maybe isn't the best at photosynthesizing has a heck of a grocery store in the form of the fetching fungi. So it'll share the grocery store things with the tree that's, able to photosynthesize. So those are just examples of how life forms will associate and relate to one another in ways that make the survival of both possible. And I would hasten to add, when those relationships are going really, really well, that's the good life. That is the good life.
So what you're describing is to me, rather amazing, complex dance. And, the complexity of it as we kind of scratch around the edges and start to learn. It's very exciting. And it's not the kind of thing that one could easily replicate with a kid's chemistry set. I'm curious about this relationship between the plant and the sunshine and this whole, swath of life living in the plant zone, in the root zone. How long has that relationship worked out? How long has that existed on our planet?
That's an old relationship, Dave. Some 400 and some million years old. That's been going on. And the way that this all started is, plants didn't start out on land. Plants started out in these watery, aquatic environments, whether freshwater or saltwater. And then, like any being, eventually you bump up into some other habitat. And for those plants, those first plants long, long, long ago, that was the land. And they were these little stick-like things. They didn't have big floppy leaves. Flowers and pollination, that wouldn't be around for a couple 100 million more years. So they were these little stick-like things, and they got up onto land, and then the next thing is, well, what are they going to eat? Right? The ocean is a very different place than an environment of soil. And it's thought that fungi were already present, and there they were in the soil, and there they were doing their fungal things. Like a lot of fungi, they're decomposers, and so whatever organic matter was laying around, the fungi, and that may well have been just merely other microbes at that point if we didn't have plants. And so they're decomposing and processing and consuming and getting nutrients out of organic matter. Then these little stick-like things show up, little tiny things, and they have some primitive kind of a root system, and they can't just lay there on top of the soil. They need to prop themselves up. They need to start being a plant. And so roots began to interact with the life of the soil, and fungi and bacteria were some of those first original life forms. And because the fungi and bacteria were on land before plants, they kind of had, they already had some relationships worked out. And so what the plants brought to it was, the power of photosynthesis. So fungi and bacteria are like, this big thing, this thing can photosynthesize. This becomes a whole new food source for us. But let's make sure we keep those plants around because this is such a great food source. And so that then is how, the nutrient acquisition that fungi do, came into the picture. And it's not just phosphorus. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's other minerals that fungi help plants acquire. And as for bacteria, right, they're sort of stuck in place. They're unlike a mycorrhizal fungi that has these hyphae that are, clear across the room and out to the street corner. Bacteria are stuck in place, but what they have is they have a whole community, think about a diverse community of bacteria and the genomic potential, all of the genes of those bacteria and everything that they are capable of. And so plant sends exudates down to the root system. The bacteria is consuming those, and they're turning these exudates into all kinds of different metabolites. So the bacterium gets what it needs out of the exudate, and then the rest is considered, waste product. That goes out into the environment. Something else is consuming that and turning that into some kind of a metabolite. And what's known about plants and members of the microbiome is that some of these metabolites from microbes help plants grow. In fact, there's growth promoting hormones that bacteria in the soil are making and giving back to the plant in exchange for exudates. And so this is actually brilliant because the soil is this vast, sea on land, essentially. And if you can stock that sea on land with bacteria and other microorganisms that can produce all kinds of metabolites that function as not just growth hormones, but also as nutrients, as other things that plants need in order to survive and live. I mean, why would the plant bother to make those things on its own when it's surrounded by this sea of things that it needs that its microbiome can make, right? The plant's got more important things to do, like photosynthesize, like set fruit, like grow big and strong, right? So that is sort of the key thing about, the plant microbiome, most of which resides, the plant microbiome, most of it is in the soil. It is not sitting around out there on the leaf or on the fruit or something like that. It is in the soil. And that's why an awful lot of plant protection and defenses and its metabolism and its physiology and so on is concerned with what is going on in the root system, what's coming in to the roots and what's leaving in the roots. And this, to me, I think it just makes a plant and the plant lifestyle amazing, and if we were able to support that plant lifestyle and work with it better, that's where we would be seeing, I think, different outcomes in agriculture, different outcomes in all kinds of setting in which we rely on plants.
Yeah. So for the plant, the root zone is like the gut. That's where most of the life is, just as for us in our gut, that's where most of our microbiome is as well.
That's right. And I call soil the greatest gut on earth. I mean, honestly. Yeah. In a fully functioning soil chock full of life, that is the greatest gut on earth. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let me ask, we got 400 million years of these developing, evolving relationships in which at this point, we don't even have names for the majority of the players. We just go, I don't know what that is. At what point did animals come along, mammals? At what point did we and our ancestors and our brothers and sisters co-evolve to be part of this system?
Yeah, that's we came sort of last in the chain of beings that came onto this planet that began to, coexist with plants. Dinosaurs, so if plants came from the ocean onto land about 450 million years ago, the dinosaurs, the giant lizards, right? We all know that's the great extinction they came after that, and I think about 65 million years ago, that was a great extinction event. And after the dinosaurs died off, then the mammals came. And some of those dinosaurs, of course, turned into birds, chickens and crows and things like that. And then we came along. We're part of this long line of mammalian evolution. And, our humans proper, I'm not a human evolution person, but I believe it was around 2 million years ago is when Homo sapiens, or close to what was Homo sapiens, began to move out of Africa. We began to spread ourselves around the globe. I'm not exactly sure on these numbers, but anyway, we are the most recent comer to the history of life. And what I think is interesting is that in particular about animals, and in particular the herbivores, because we've got all these plants, that had they'd figured it out with the microbes. Okay, yeah, now we're these big plants and we're all leafy and we got flowers and we can do all of this stuff. And then it was like, wow, that's a lot of biomass. Something is going to eat that. Well, insects were probably the first things that came along to eat some of that biomass. But then you got these big mammals. Then you got these big herbivores, these big, these herds of, everything, right? Buffalo, gazelle, impala, antelope, right? Every continent has got its version of some fairly large herbivore that has co-evolved with a particular kind of vegetation. So our grasslands, right? That's where all of these herbivores. So that was one, 3 square meals for herbivores for millions of years off the vegetation on this planet. That's pretty amazing to think about. And every time, one life form starts interacting with another life form, they start to adapt to one another and they start to co-evolve. And that is pretty much what, has happened between herbivores and plants. When you think about how diverse, let's say, an undisturbed, temperate sort of plant community that has native herbivores in it, there's a lot of different things to eat in there, but we also know that plants, they want to keep living too. So they have all their defenses, and a lot of which are these phytochemicals. And the way that herbivores get around that is they don't just eat one plant, because that would do them in. I mean, if the things that eat sagebrush, if all they ever did was eat sagebrush, they'd die. That sagebrush is loaded with terpenes and all of these phytochemicals that you eat enough of them, you're going to get sick. And not just like a bad stomach ache, but sick. So what does an herbivore figure out to do? Oh, I'll take a bite of that, and I'll eat on that for about 10 minutes, and then, I got too many alkaloids in me. I think I'm going to go eat something with a lot of tannins in it, so I can get those alkaloids bound up in my gut, and they're going to quit bugging me, and they're going to quit bugging my rumen. And so this is what, this is what herbivores do. Fred Provenza's book is brilliant on this, and I know you'll be talking with him soon. So herbivores have figured out how to eat, I think Fred says, somewhere between 25 and 50 different species a day in order to do, really what they're looking for is, herbivores are looking for flavor, they're looking for nutrients, and they're looking for their medicine in their diet. And if they have to sort through 25 or 50 or more plants to do that, that's what the herbivore body is built for. That's what their brain is built for. That's what the rumen is built for, a very, very interesting place in an herbivore, where most of their microbiome is. And that's where all of the cellular, at a cellular level in an herbivore, that animal is picking up on all of those different phytochemicals. And I sort of think about it, I'm not usually thinking in terms of algorithms, but it's helpful in this case, I think. I think you take ruminant biology, and a phytochemical hits the gut, it hits the receptors in a particular cell, and the cell is like, oh, this is a good one. If you like this one, you might like this one, and this one. And so that communicates, say, with the bovine brain, and the bovine's looking around. okay, I think I know where to get that. I think that's over there. So, all this notion that animals are dumb and that grazing animals in particular are boring, or they don't really know what they're doing when they're ambling around slowly, nibbling on things. There is a lot going on that we do not have a complete understanding of. And whenever I sort of run into a situation like that where it's evident that it's complex, I usually like to land on the side of, hey, instead of manipulating this, and you know how we can manipulate things in agriculture, instead of manipulating this, why don't we look for ways to support it? And why don't we look for ways to let it happen? Because the hundreds of millions of years that ruminants have been evolving with grassland ecosystems, that's where I'm going to put my insurance policy on that. That's a long time. And not only is it a long time frame that I'm banking on, but the fact that this vegetation system is still here and this ruminant is still here, I think that's success. That's the success for me that I would want to build on versus, the rumen, wow. If we can just, David and I are writing this new book and we're deep into the animal science now. I can't tell you how many things I've read on, wow, if we could just tweak the rumen this way or that way and get rid of the protozoan, then more feed would move through the animal, and that means more meat on the animal. And it's like, excuse me, wait a minute. The last time that we started dropping things and killing things off out of ecosystems, it didn't work out so well, right? You take all the keystone predators like wolves out of a system, and Aldo Leopold writes about this elegantly. You take keystone predator out of a system, all of a sudden you've got deer galore eating the crap out of the landscape, and then you're getting erosion, and then you're getting water problems, and on it goes. So generally, pulling major parts out of an ecosystem does not work so well.
Our challenge is we don't usually understand what the keystone species might be.
Right.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you'll subscribe, tell your friends, and leave us a review on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you found us. A video version of this interview, as well as a full transcript with links related to today's conversation, is found at realorganicproject.org/episode 25. Please join us next time for a continuation of today's interview with biologist, author, and speaker Anne Biklé, as she dives more deeply into human nutrition. To find a Real Organic farm near you, visit realorganicproject.org/farms.